Hello and welcome to our overview of the Hex Grid plugin for Unreal Engine 5. This video is going to show you some of the steps you go through to set up the plugin and get going with it, and we'll break this into a few different videos, and then hopefully we'll show a little example in a later video of how you might build a few bits and pieces with the grid. So to get started, you'll need to install the plugin into your Unreal Engine through the Unreal Engine launcher, and once it's installed, go ahead and go to settings and go to plugins, and then we're just going to go and search for Hex, and we'll just make sure Hex Grids is turned on. And once you tick that, go ahead and restart the editor, and then you should have access to the Hex Grids. So to find it, we're going to go to settings, and we're going to make sure engine content is ticked and plugin content is also ticked. So once you've done that, go ahead and open up your engine folder here and come down to plugins, open this one up here, and then we're going to scroll down and we're going to try and find the Hex Grid plugin, which is here. So Hex Grid content is the one we're going to be working with. Now, if you're doing a big project, I actually recommend you go to your install directory for the plugin, which by default on Windows is like C, Program Files, Epic Games, UE 5.3, Engine, Plugins, Marketplace. That's where the launcher installs all your plugins. And find the Hex Grids and just copy that and go to your project and make a new folder called plugins and paste it in there, and that way you've got a local copy of the Hex Grid plugin that you can customize as much as you wish, and there's no risk of like future updates breaking your content, and you can always revert back to the source one if you need to, but we're not going to do that for this video. We're just going to go ahead and work with the standard installation version. So I'm going to right click on this Hex Grid content. I'm just going to go ahead and add it to favorites, which is going to pop it up here in our favorites window. If you don't see that, you can go ahead and enable favorites, which is somewhere. It's just on by default, I believe, show favorites there. And then if we go ahead and select this, we can see we've got example content and Hex Grids. Now, example stuff is just generic meshes for the demo room. So we're going to always work in our Hex Grid plugin. And within that, we've got blueprints and we've got maps. These are the two really relevant ones. The rest of it is just the meshes and the textures to power those things. So if we go into blueprints first, we've got this Hex Grids blueprint here. This is your standard working blueprint. This is the one you're going to customize, override, do whatever you want with. Now, if you are just working with the engine installed version of the plugin, I highly recommend you go ahead and grab this Hex Grid blueprint. And sorry, let's just make sure we scroll up here. Go ahead and just drag and drop it into your content folder and say copy here. Okay, that's going to give us a local copy that we can always work on. And again, we've got that source version here to fall back on if something goes wrong. So if we go ahead and let's just make a new map first. Let's go File, New Level, Basic. And then we'll go ahead and take our Hex Grid and we'll just drag and drop this into the world. And I'm just going to center it on the grid center. So it's 0, 0, 0. Okay, so this is the grid as it comes in by default. And if we go ahead and select our Hex Grid in the outliner, we've got some kind of default options we can go ahead and play with. But mostly this plugin is built as a framework. So if you're building your game, your project, you're likely going to want to customize the blueprint quite heavily to meet your needs. It's not an out-the-box solution to any one project because everybody's project is different. So this is not tailored to be one specific genre of game or one particular use case. It's a generic framework of hexagonal grid functionality that you can then customize as you need. So because of that, there is going to be a learning curve to this plugin. You are going to need to learn a bit about how it works. So just keep that in mind when you buy this. It's not necessarily going to solve all of your problems out of the box. It's just going to solve kind of the backbone mathematical functionality of a hexagonal grid and give you various wrappers and examples to show how you might build a project into it. So just some of the defaults quickly. We'll just kind of go through them quite fast. We've got grid shape here, and this is setting the actual size of the grid size, sorry. So this X value is going to be how big it is in X. And if you're setting a grid shape that's a hexagon, and below that we can see the grid shape. So we've got hexagons. Hexagons and triangles are only based off this first X value because they're always uniform in size. Rectangles and parallelograms, these use both the X and the Y value because you can set those independently. So if we go to our hexagonal grid shape and we set the grid size to say 1, then we can see we have a 1 radius around that origin point, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the grid goes out from there. This Y value won't do anything on these setups because a hexagonal grid is always uniform in size. If we go over to rectangle, and now we set it to say 1 by 1, we can see we have just 1 tile, 2 by 1, 2 by 2, and so on. So let's go to say 6 by 12, and that gives us a little rectangle grid. We also have triangle grids and parallelogram grids, but most likely you're going to be using rectangles or hexagons. These are your go-to standards. So if we go ahead and pick rectangle for a second, we've got this center grid option, and this defines where your 0, 0 point is on the grid. So if we untick this axis point here, this is going to be your 0, 0 coordinate, and from there it will go 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3 outwards. If we center this, it will try and offset the grid. So 0, 0 is now here. So the tiles below and to the left are actually going to be negative numbers. So this will go from, say, -6 to +6, minus 12 plus 12, that type of thing. So keep that in mind, depending on how you want to organize your grid and how you want to handle the axis and layout. It can be easier to have this not centered or centered. It's entirely up to you. Grid scale is defining the spacing between the tiles. So this is the size or the scale of the actual hexagonal grid logic. So within the hexagonal grid, you basically have a standard 2D grid, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2, etc. And then we place meshes on those tiles. Now we can scale those values using this number here, and we have an X and a Y value. If we change this to 120, you'll see it increases the scaling. And the reason the X is currently 0 is because we automate that setup. Down here in the advanced option, if you just drop this down, you can see we've got this calculate grid X scale. And the reason we have this is because there's a mathematical formula to define the spacing of the X and Y, and there's a relationship between those two numbers. So rather than you trying to calculate it or eyeball it, we do this for you. So if I change this down to 90, this X value has been automatically calculated for us. If we untick this, you can individually set the spacing. So if we say 150 on this, you can now see it's spaced out much more on this X value compared to the Y value. So it's up to you whether you want to do that. It depends on your grid, whether it's a uniform grid or you're making more of a custom shape. I'm going to go ahead and tick this back on. Per tile scale is just scaling the meshes. You probably don't necessarily need this. If you're bringing in your own custom meshes, maybe you need to kind of just scale them to sort of match the grid size, but you could also increase the scaling instead. It's entirely up to you. This is just kind of an accessibility feature for improving that. Same goes for rotation. If we rotate the grid by 90 on the Z, you're going to get the rotation of the tiles. These are just there for you to play with and see how they're used in the blueprint. Per tile height variation, same sort of concept. It just scales them a little bit randomly. If you're trying to use this as more of a random background sort of piece or a decoration, you may want to use that. Mesh component type, this is really important. This is defining what type of meshes we use. So if we use static meshes, they're going to be fairly easy to work with. You can line trace to them and get that static mesh component. It's going to be fairly optimized in that they are just components in this one blueprint. But if you start making your grid quite big, you're going to see a frame rate performance hit. And that's not even due to the meshes, it's just due to the amount of components you're having to create and Unreal's having to keep an eye on. So static meshes are a good kind of starting point, but there are limitations to be aware of. Instance static meshes have more limitations, but they are vastly more optimized. So with this in mind, we can increase the grid to say 40 by 20, and now we can have lots of tiles. We can go down to hexagons, and this is going to be a lot because now this is 40 in each of the 6 axis of the hex grid. So this is now a lot of tiles, and if you try and do this with a static mesh, you're going to see frame rate performance issues. So you need to pick what mesh type you want based on how big you want your grid to be. But be aware that working with instance mesh components is quite a bit more complicated. The instance meshes randomize their indexes when you change the grid. They're hard to kind of query in quite the same way. So interstatic meshes work well when you're trying to define a large grid, but it's not necessarily interactive. It's just a mesh that you're then going to spawn things on top of, and the things that spawn on top of it are going to be the things you're interacting with, not necessarily the grid itself. You're not trying to change the core grid, you're just building upon it. And it's totally fine to use this and then spawn houses or rivers and things on top of these as just standard meshes. It's really up to you how you want to work. And then new as of like 5.0, we have access to these blueprints as well. And this will spawn blueprints dynamically at runtime. So if we pick this, nothing's going to happen because blueprint spawning only works at runtime. But if we go ahead and simulate or play an editor, you're going to see these grids appear. And we've got kind of a little shader going across them just to show off. You can see the blueprints are childs of this active blueprint. So you can move the hex grid around and all the blueprints will follow it. Blueprints are obviously very, very powerful in terms of what you can do with them, and they can store all of your metadata for your game. You can have really detailed information. So if your tile should have actual proper information about the game, you really need kind of elaborate setups, then blueprints are very good. But obviously they are the least performant because you're spawning blueprints for every tile. And there'll be a little bit of a different working methodology because you'll want to get the blueprint and work with the blueprint on each tile. I'm going to come out of play mode now, and I'm just going to reset this back to static meshes. And I'm just going to make the grid a little bit smaller as well. So those are kind of the core details panel setups, and other stuff in here is mostly for playing with and getting some of the demo content to work. So this is the generation stuff is the key stuff, and from there we're going to want to dive into the blueprint and we're going to get playing with that. So in the next video I'm just going to go through the blueprint in general and highlight bits you might want to expand and where things work. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.